Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, reclusive and paranoid, has just ventured out of his country to meet President Putin in Russia's Far East. The two of them, pariahs, a despot duo. Putin wants arms for his war in Ukraine, artillery shells, and more. And Kim wants satellite technology to frighten his neighbors, even the U.S., with advanced nuclear weapons programs. This week, I talked to a former CIA intelligence analyst on North Korea and on Putin's Russia, American professor Robert English, and how the modern-day leader finds solace in old ways of thinking borrowed from the USSR. All right, Sue Mi Terry is a former CIA officer, a researcher, a former intelligence analyst who specialized in East Asia and is an expert on international politics involving North and South Korea. Welcome, Sue Mi.
Thank you for having me on.
Can you, first of all, tell me why now, this meeting in Vladivostok in Russia between President Putin and Kim Jong-un?
Well, there are two leaders that are completely isolated from the world, and there's a mutual interest that are served by meeting at this point. Putin needs badly needed, ammunition for his war efforts in Ukraine, and Kim Jong-un needs food aid and fuel, and more than that, technical support for his military satellites, for his long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, for nuclear power submarine. So it makes sense from Putin and Kim Jong-un's perspective to meet now. And COVID restrictions, we're just coming out of pandemic. So it makes sense from both of their perspectives.
Do you believe that this is a new road that the Russians are paving? Or do you think that, in fact, behind the scenes, Russia was already supplying technology? I mean, a lot of people are saying that the last intercontinental ballistic missile test by North Korea looked remarkably similar to the Russian technology on the Topol M missile, for instance.
Well, first, I think it's pretty pathetic and ironic that Russia, which used to be, this nuclear power country that's a patron and was the one who was aiding North Korea, is now turning to North Korea, 198th ranked economy in the world that cannot feed its own population, for support. Now, in terms of Russia's support to North Korea, that may be very well true, that Russia has always provided some technology and help. But now this is overt, which means I think it's about degrees, right? They can just amp up much more in terms of supporting North Korea. Now, if you remember, in 2017, in the fall of 2017, China and Russia actually implemented sanctions against North Korea. So it's not supposed to be such an overt thing. But now, Russia being internationally isolated itself, I guess doesn't care. So it's about degrees. And I am concerned about this overt technology transfer.
Where could it potentially lead? I mean, I know North Korea wants food and energy, but Russia, in return, could give things like, nuclear submarine technology. And North Korea already has a very advanced nuclear program. What's the danger here?
Well, Kim Jong-un's goal is to perfect his nuclear weapons program, his WMD program. He's been expanding, modernizing his nuclear and missile arsenal. North Korea tested some 80 missiles last year. So this will help North Korea further advance and perfect their program. Last month, North Korea rolled out a diesel-based submarine. Now they can have nuclear submarines. So this is not good news. It's a win-win for Putin and Kim Jong-un, but this is not good news for the United States and the West.
Why do you think that Russia, first of all, signed on to the sanctions in the first place? I mean, some people said that they were worried about North Korea themselves, and they were in fear of perhaps the satellite program that North Korea is after. So why do 180-degree turnabout now for some artillery shells, in essence. I mean, millions of artillery shells, and it's critical in the war effort. But I mean, President Putin is walking a dangerous road here.
He's walking a dangerous road, but Russia's number one priority right now is winning the war in Ukraine. And this is a war about supply lines. And so he needs his ammunition. So he's turning to North Korea. Now, when Putin actually decided to implement sanctions in the fall of 2017, this was under the Trump era. Remember this, fire and fury era, when President Trump was calling Kim Jong-un a rocket man on a suicide mission. So there was a concern that there could have been a conflict. So Russia and China surprisingly implemented sanctions. But now it's no longer 2017. It's a very different world that we're living in. And there's a loose alliance relationship between Russia and China and North Korea. And, Putin and Kim Jong-un's meeting is really a meeting of, this unholy duo, right? This is not good, as I said. But I think Putin is focused more on Russia's war on Ukraine. So he needs help from North Korea. And North Korea has a large stockpile of munitions.
What does this marriage of despots bring us?
Well, it threatens the region further. This will help Russia's war efforts in Ukraine, so that makes that situation more dangerous. It will help modernize and expand North Korea's nuclear weapons program, which will make North Korea more dangerous to the region, to South Korea, to Japan, and to the rest of the world. So this is, again, not, from U.S.'s perspective and West perspective, this is very concerning development.
Do you believe that Russia and North Korea sought the blessing of China for this, if you want to call it an unholy alliance, but it's an alliance nonetheless?
It's interesting how much China knows and how much China will approve of this. I think it's complicated, and China is the wild card here. North Korea traditionally has always sort of played China and Russia off one another, right? Remember going back to Sino-Soviet rivalry. And by relying on Russia, it will reduce North Korea's dependence on China, which China would not like. So I think China is going to look at this whole situation with a little bit of weary eye. So we'll see how Beijing responds, but it's a little bit complicated from China's perspective.
It's a little bit complicated from Washington's perspective, too. I mean, here you have the spokesman yesterday, wagging his finger at Russia, saying, and North Korea, saying that they better not start trading in weapons and that there will be consequences. I mean, they have been, putting a tighter hold on the throat of North Korea for several decades, and the nuclear program has just gone ahead regardless.
Absolutely. Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, said there's going to be a price to pay. But in reality, what price? Both countries are already very isolated. In terms of sanctioning North Korea, for sanctions to be effective, China and Russia have to implement sanctions, and they have not been doing that in recent years. So what more can we do to North Korea? The talks between Washington and Pyongyang have completely broken down. There's a complete impasse between Washington and Pyongyang. So I'm not sure what price. North Korea conducted 80 tests last year, missile tests, all in violation of United Nations Security Council resolutions. Did United Nations Security Council respond in any way? China and Russia and UNSC could not even come up with a condemnation of these launches. So again, price to pay, I don't know what price. There's not a whole lot of options here in terms of pressuring North Korea.
What are the options? If you say there's not very many, are there any? And what would they be?
Well, the options are what the Biden administration is already doing, which is to strengthen trilateral relationship between United States, South Korea, and Japan to make sure that we're all on the same page in responding to future North Korean provocations. President Biden did host President Yoon Suk-yeol of South Korea and Prime Minister Kishida of Japan at Camp David. Thankfully, Korea and Japan relationship has improved. Now that we're going to do trilateral military exercises, there is going to be a greater information, intelligence sharing. And so in terms of trying to stop this meeting and stop this trade, I think that's very difficult to do at this moment.
Last question to you. Your impressions of Kim Jong-un, who was largely silent during the pandemic, disappeared for months at a time. Um, what do you think is happening to him, with him, in North Korea?
Well, Kim is rapidly expanding his WMD program, but internally, the economic situation is quite dire. North Korea was the first country to close the border with China at the beginning of COVID pandemic in January 2020. So the economic situation is dire in the sense that border closure did more to had more of an impact in North Korea's economy than sanctions ever could. So there's internal situation that's bad in terms of food shortages and malnutrition and so on. Then, of course, he's still focusing all on expanding his WMD program. So we'll see. I think this is why Kim Jong-un is making this trip to Russia. He's looking for fuel, food aid from Russia, as well as technology transfer to expand his WMD program.
To me, Terry, it's great for you to share your thoughts, and thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me on.
Robert English is an American academic, author, historian, and international relations scholar who specializes in Eastern Europe, and particularly in the former USSR and Russia. His official title, he's an associate professor of international foreign policy and defense analysis at the University of Southern California School of International Relations. With that out of the way, welcome, Robert. Good to meet you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
What is Russia doing? This will play later, but as we speak, the Kim Jong-un is in Vladivostok. He's gotten off his armored train, and he's going to be meeting with President Putin. What are they doing?
They are the leaders of what we might say two pariah states that are extraordinarily at odds with the West right now, who are finding common ground. Not just because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, although that's part of it, but because they have very compatible economic and technological needs. And it looks like they're going to do a deal. How expansive, we don't know. But the outlines have been described in all the news media, right? North Korea has these large stockpiles of good old-fashioned artillery shells and unguided rockets, for multiple launch rocket systems that the Russians could very well use in Ukraine. Their supplies are running low. And of course, Russia has a lot of things that North Korea needs, from basic foodstuffs to missile and submarine technology. So some kind of deals are in the offing, and how extensive they are and how broadly they're going to violate sanctions, that's going to be interesting to follow.
Yeah, and some of the numbers are staggering. I mean, because Russia, up until this point, if people have any understanding of what's going on the front line of Ukraine, had fired about 1.5 million to 1.7 million artillery shells. They were trying to ratchet up their military-industrial complex to deliver like 2.5 million. Now they're saying they could, in the coming year, hope to fire 7 million rounds of artillery. I mean, that's how grinding, bloody that frontline conflict is. And North Korea doesn't have anything really high tech for them or cutting edge, but they do, since the 1950s, have these huge stockpiles.
Yeah, and they built their arms production, they built their army basically on Soviet models. So guess what? The caliber is exactly right. The charges fit. They are not high-tech guided projectiles. This is good old-fashioned, essentially World War II, 1950s technology. But for the kind of pounding that you accurately describe, it's just the thing. And unless Russia can double again, I think I saw the same numbers as you. From about 1.5, they're hoping to produce 3 million shells this year. But if they're going to fire twice that many, then they can't keep up. Their own reserve stockpiles are being depleted. Whatever Iran, North Korea, maybe some African countries we've heard can provide, will be needed to fill that gap. Let's hope they're not all fired and the war ends before another 7 million rounds are fired by Russia and an equivalent amount by the Ukrainians. But
what's happened to Russia's caution? They originally were cautious of North Korea like everybody else. They didn't really want them to have a nuclear program. They were certainly worried about their rockets being able to set up a satellite program. What's happened to Putin? Is this just an act of desperation, or is it something more?
I'm a little hesitant to use the word desperation, only because the Ukrainian side is in a similar condition. Right? They, of course, can't produce many shells at all. They're entirely dependent on their Western backers. And we in the United States and European Union, NATO countries are having big difficulty filling their stockpiles. So we are, in a sense, just about as desperate as, in supporting our Ukrainian friends as the Russians are. So desperation isn't quite the word, where both sides are just scrambling to keep up this brutal pace of killing. So that's part of it. But you're right to point to Putin and ask what something more fundamental has changed, not just his approach to North Korea, his regard for that regime and what Kim Jong-un represents, but his place in the world, right? This is one pariah state embracing another. I mean, what will follow from this is, this open flouting of UN sanctions, which Russia helped craft. As you know, you made allusion to that. Back after 2009, 2014, 15, various rounds of sanctions that Russia backed in concert with the United States, France, other Western allies. So this kind of activity is flouting those sanctions. Heretofore, they have been doing it quietly, smaller purchases, clandestine transfers. But if they embrace each other publicly and announce a deal, then they're saying, the heck with everyone else. I was going to use a vulgar term, but maybe this is for family audiences. We will just do it openly. And yes, that's crossing a line in saying, we don't care. We're not going to try to get back into the West's good graces. We have no problem making common cause with another pariah state. And I, like you, wonder how thoroughly that's thought through. Does Putin have no concern for, at some point, having sanctions relief on his own country, reestablishing technological investment ties with the West so his battered economy can recover? It is, as I think you're suggesting, another fateful step down a path of total isolation for maybe decades to come. It's a very sad moment for Russia.
You've written a lot about the former Soviet Union and the USSR. Putin watched the collapse of the former Soviet Union. I'm not sure he embraced it, but he certainly later on cashed in on capitalism and of the trade that was filtered through the Kremlin. Do you have a sense of where Russia is going under Vladimir Putin? Does he have a philosophy? Like you could at least say there was a philosophical branch of communism and how they saw their state and socialism. What is Putin's raison d'etre?
I think he's ad-libbing. I think he hasn't thought through these latest ventures. And since they haven't gone as expected, he's forced to adjust. And those decisions and those policies are taking Russia down this path of isolation, complete pariah status. What do I mean by that? We go back to, let's say, 2008, 2009, and the George Bush administration that announced that at some point in the future, Georgia and Ukraine would be admitted to NATO. And that infuriated Putin. And we saw then armed clashes within Georgia turn into a Russian invasion, right? Shortly thereafter. But Putin obviously could have subdued all of Georgia and taken it if he'd wanted to, right? He didn't. That and other moves, continued cooperation with the West over some things like Iran or North Korea at that time, suggest that he was trying to have it both ways: expand Russian influence, right? Push back against Western influence and the NATO alliance in his perceived backyard, but keep good relations. And all the way up to February, March of 2022, they were still finishing the Nord Stream pipeline. They didn't plan to blow it up. They didn't plan to end all energy relations with Western Europe. This all came as an unpleasant surprise, as spillover from this quick invasion that was supposed to subdue Ukraine in a flash, instead going wrong. And now he's embroiled in a massive, bloody, brutal war filled with civilian casualties and war crimes. And that's what I mean by ad-libbing. I don't think he planned a year and a half ago to be dancing with Kim Jong-un and burning all these bridges with the West. But I don't know inside his head if he's not maybe even happy with this. Maybe on some level reverting back to kind of a Brezhnev style, almost Soviet Union, that is in permanent hostility with the West, where he can have this propaganda, right, of a country under siege, where it becomes more and more like the Soviet Union that you and I knew in those last years, those last decades, is something he's unhappy with. A closed country, a country of sort of police state iron discipline, even if it's going to cost economic growth and put them on a second-rate status for decades to come, maybe he's made his peace with that and even likes the idea of being some kind of, generalissimo of a police state. I can't understand him, but I don't think it was thought through. And I do believe these are ad hoc decisions. And so, again, the North Korea embrace right now proceeds from necessity to get the arms he needs. But along with it, he seems very comfortable with Brezhnev-style Soviet relations with these odious client states.
So can I just explore that with you for a moment? Because you've written about it and maybe you could explain it. And I understand we don't have that much time to go through it, but we have some time. And you wrote about the old way of thinking in the former Soviet Union, and then that there was an intellectual sort of revolution under Gorbachev. If Putin is adopting the old way of thinking in the former Soviet Union, can you give me some clue what he's latched onto or latched back onto?
Well, as for an ideological anchor, he's thrashing around. He himself was a product of that Soviet KGB Cold War hostility with the West mentality. But that was, of course, based on Marxism-Leninism, and he doesn't believe that. At the same time, he has more recently voiced this kind of messianic Russian nationalism, the Alexander Dugin, the Eurasianism. I don't think he believes that either. He wasn't propagating that just a few years ago. I think a lot of that is for his domestic audience to justify Ukraine. So I don't think he has an ideological anchor. He doesn't deeply believe in Russian history or those kinds of anti-Western philosophers. He certainly doesn't believe in Marxism-Leninism. What does that leave us with? He believes in a strong Russian state standing up to the West, refusing to become part of the liberal American-led world order, just for the sake of refusing, right? Russia has to be an equal. Russia has to have its own backyard, its own Monroe Doctrine. It must never be second rate in any alliance or international organization. And so it's better, right, to ad lib with this anti-Western confrontation, add back in control over these, territories where there are Russian populations, where he can make some kind of historic claim. Catherine the Great built up the Crimea. And behind that wall, and it will be an iron curtain of sorts, he will be satisfied, even though any economist left, if he has any left who are Western looking, will tell him that's a path of steady degradation. And we don't even have to look much further than out our windows to see what climate change will do to petrostates, or his perceived economic base, based on selling oil and gas and maybe some coal and minerals, will of course dwindle. If we're still pumping as much oil and gas in 10 years as we are now, then we're all fried. So it's a wasting asset, but he's not looking out 10 years. I don't believe it's, again, I come back to this. He's ad-libbing. It's an ad hoc set of decisions, and he's grabbing at pieces of history or philosophy to justify it in this sort of incoherent fashion.
He's grabbing at it, but I mean, a lot of people would say that during the pandemic, I mean, he immersed himself. He was surrounded by the Kremlin historian, I think, and some people wonder, Putin never. You're right. He never had these big visions of restoring the empire and reclaiming Russian lands. He expressed some sorrow at the breakup of the Soviet Union, and that there was a human catastrophe. As many as Russian Slavs were, left in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, elsewhere. But he didn't have that. What are the chances there's been a kind of, I mean, a lot of people see him as the dawn of a crime family. Do you think that some of those members of the family, of his inner circle, there's been kind of a coup during the Kremlin? The hardliners have come to power, people like Patrushev, and that Putin is really not steering the ship at all?
I can't answer about that. This is now pure speculation, as is, I suppose, the sort of long distance psychoanalysis we're performing, trying to understand how much of this was a gradual evolution on his part. Maybe during COVID, that isolation, he did start believing or embracing some of this, but it's still not a deeply held lifelong commitment. I don't know how to answer. I like to come back. I'll try to tell this story quickly and you'll understand it, to an anecdote that Russians tell that to me sums up what really motivates Putin. And you remember back in the early 2000s, there was the debate, not only about bringing back the old Soviet anthem, but they actually considered bringing back the red flag. They have the tricolor, but indeed they did decide to bring back the old.
Brought back the anthem.
Brought back the anthem. So the joke goes like this. An aide to Putin says, Vladimir Vladimirovich, we have a proposal from a capitalist country for $10 billion. They want to give us $10 billion. Really? $10 billion. That's right. They only have one small request. Yes. What do they want in return for $10 billion? They want us to embrace the red flag, go back to that red flag that so many of our countrymen want anyway. Is that all they want for $10 billion? They want us to do something we might do anyway? Well, yes, and one more little stipulation. What's that? Down in the corner of that flag, drink Coca-Cola. Says Putin. 10 billion, Tell me, when does our contract with Aquafresh expire? So we know the tricolor toothpaste. And what's the point of that joke? He doesn't believe in anything except money, or let's say money and power. That all these nationalists were saying we must go back to the glory of the Stalin era, or the czarist, symbolism of this. And what was he thinking about? Which one will profit me more? And that's certainly how most of us, analysts in Russia, in the West, Kremlin watchers, regarded Putin and his true motivations for a long time.
Although a lot of people would say in recent history tells you he certainly got the power part, because he's isolated the country, he's controlled the country, he's cut off Russia, and he's all they have now. But in terms of money, I mean, the billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars are lost.
He and his top oligarchs, of course, are fabulously wealthy because they can still skim off enormous petro profits. But of course, the country at large is becoming more and more impoverished. But the point of that joke is just that for a long time, in coming to power and in ruling for the first decade, at least, he didn't seem to have strong philosophical principled beliefs. It was about power. It was about his own power and the power of Russia. It didn't go much beyond that. And at that time, it still meant decent economic relations with the West. They wanted to sell gas to Western Europe, highly profitable. They needed foreign investment in their, not just petroleum industry, but automobiles, aircraft, and much else. So of course, power, maximizing economic gain meant a certain level of economic good relations with the West. And again, the history of the Nord Stream pipeline And all the money and effort the Russians invested into that right up to the spring of 2022 suggests that that was a surprise. They somehow thought the war would be quick. They'd still be selling gas to Western Europe, that the Western Europeans would accept a quick and clean victory, at least in conquest of half of Ukraine. Who knows what would have come, remove Zelensky, put in a puppet regime. But clearly he planned for something quick that would not upset all of these relations, political and economic, with the West. Militarily, it was a disaster. Maybe politically, it wasn't well thought out either. But it's actually interesting for us to speculate, what would our German friends and our Italian and French allies, Macron, Angela Merkel at the time, and who knows in Italy, have done in the event of a quick and clean Russian victory? Maybe they would have made their peace with it. NATO wouldn't have had time to react. And those business interests in Germany would have said, we can deal with this. It didn't work out that way, so we're improvising too. But certainly Putin, if he's found a heartfelt ideology, I don't know how heartfelt it can be over a couple of years. I still look forward to the psychohistorians who have all the records, all the archives, all the interviews a decade hence, maybe 20 years hence, post-Putin, to fill us in on just what happened to him in those recent years. I'm still not convinced by any one version, so I'm very dubious about taking any of Putin's philosophical pronouncements seriously.
I'm deeply disappointed, Robert, because I don't have the answers either, and I thought you would have them all today. But anyway, you have great questions, better than mine, and I appreciate your time. It's great to meet you. Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. This was a pleasure. Maybe we'll talk again soon.
And that's our backstory this week. Putin also made some remarkable comments on the American political system while in the Far East, calling indictments of Donald Trump political persecution, demonstrating the rottenness of the U.S. political system, he said. That doesn't mean it is persecution or rotten, but Putin never misses a chance to stir division and discontent, to undermine Western democracies. Isn't it telling that he sees Donald Trump as an ally? Thanks for listening to Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis, and I'll talk to you again soon.